Hello everybody, Marcus Godwin here with the Shroom Vremeni Noise of Time blog. Well, in my last programme I talked about the 100% lie false flag operation of the massacre in Bucha. And I mentioned the French journalist who exposed everything. His name is Adrien Bauque. And I forgot to mention some details after spending time in Donbass, which had now become part of the territory of the Russian Federation. For 8 years they were independent, self-declared independent republics from the Kiev junta after the West installed the neo-Nazi anti-Russian junta who had no other desire except to get rid of the people of Donbass, either ethnically cleanse them and kill them or force them out and into the Russian Federation itself. Monsieur Bauque, he after a while was obliged to leave the territory of the Russian Federation in order to make a new visa. This is what the rules are in many countries, and Russia unfortunately just reciprocated with these kind of rules, which means he had to leave. Now, normally speaking, he would have to go back to France. Somehow he was able to make a visa in Turkey, in Istanbul. Whether he had a French, whether he had a Turkish residence permit, I somewhat doubt, but maybe. Anyway, somehow they allowed him to make this visa in Turkey. Unfortunately, the Western secret services and Ukrainian secret services got wind of it, and as revenge for spoiling one of their most important false flags, not as important as MH17 for example, but nonetheless a very significant false flag at the beginning of the special military operation, he was attacked by two Ukrainians, as he identified them from their speech and language, with knives. He said they were professional. He came very close to losing his life. He was hospitalized immediately in an Istanbul hospital. And I remember even the president of Turkey got involved and said, we cannot guarantee the safety of this person here 100%. So he was transferred as soon as it was possible. Without risk to his health, he was transferred to Russia, where his treatment continued. As I understand, some years later now, he has made, thanks be to Almighty God, a full and total recovery. But it was a very close run thing. This is absolutely the case that all people of any nationality who are telling the truth or undermining the Western ruling elites, false flags, lies, propaganda campaigns, they are in danger more or less anywhere in the world, except such countries as Russia, well, even here actually, because assassinations are taking place of Russian individuals and other individuals too. Yeah, for sure, if you go to the Western world or anywhere where the Western world can operate with impunity, one is in great danger. So thank God that Mr. Adrien Bauque is alive and well, and he's now been granted Russian citizenship by the president himself, which is great news, because he certainly needs it. He needs to stay here because he cannot go back to France. Unless, of course, France is one day completely liberated, but that's another story. So I also talked about, on my last programme, Russian President Vladimir Putin's very interesting statements about what happened at the beginning of the SMO and how the West sabotaged the negotiations that could have led to a peaceful settlement. And he also mentioned that he was totally convinced that the Western ruling elites en masse believed that actually Russia would collapse, that the Russian population would not support the SMO, that they would rise up, they would overthrow the government, and the West would get its so long dreamed of regime change in Russia, and then they could move in to dismember the country, as they have publicly and openly planned to do. Of course, this didn't happen. He said quite openly that he's sure that this is why Finland and Sweden joined NATO at the last minute. Both countries had been neutral throughout the Cold War, and it worked very well for them. I mean, Finland was always considered one of the luckiest countries on earth, with a small population, a very rich country. They invented all sorts of things. They made a very high living standard for themselves. Now they've joined NATO. He says the idea was because the Swedish and Finnish rulers wanted in. They wanted to get a part of the spoils, as it were, when Russia collapsed. But Russia didn't collapse. In fact, the population consolidated for the large part. Of course, there are dissenters, there are people who left the country after the first wave of mobilization. There were also people who left, but the vast majority consolidated around the government. And if there is any kind of pressure on the Russian government, on the Russian president himself now from inside the country, it's precisely because too many people think that actually this war against the whole of NATO, basically, which is what it is, using Ukraine as a proxy, should be being executed with more ferocity. There is a growing frustration here about that, but I think I'll come to that later. The crux of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, especially if you are watching this in a Western country of any kind, from Australia to Norway, wherever, especially a NATO country, NATO is openly preparing for war with Russia, and they're telling you, the populations, that this has to happen. Well, the absolute fact of the matter is nobody in Russia, nobody wants war with Europe. Nobody. Russians never did. When this started after the Great Schism of 1054, when the West kept coming here trying to impose first newfangled Catholicism on the Russians, and then for centuries it was this. Then, of course, even to some extent, it could be said that the Nazi invasion was partly due to this too. Russia has been continuously attacked for 1,000 years by Europe, but Russia still loves Europe. And I can tell you all the different factions, all the different religions, the different types of people living here. None of them want a war with Russia. Russia is quite literally a zero threat to Europe. Unless, of course, Europe attacks it. Now, most European people don't want war with Russia either. It's only the ruling elites. It's only the Epstein Islanders who are pushing this agenda again and again and again. Not so long ago, I heard, for example, a French gentleman who I hadn't heard of before. His name is Nicolas Tenzer, and somehow he's become a kind of big wig on French television advising everyone that there has to be war. He said, "Il n'y a aucune solution pour le problème russe diplomatique. Donc il y a seulement une solution militaire." That means there is no solution to the Russian problem, which is diplomatic. There can only be a military solution to the Russian problem. Well, this, ladies and gentlemen, is such utter and total nonsense, because, as I just said, nobody in Russia wants war with Europe or with NATO. Nobody. Nobody wants to invade Germany, in spite of how many times Germany's invaded Russia. Nobody wants to invade France to get them back for Napoleon this time, solve the problem once and for all. Nobody wants this. The Western-loving liberals, some of whom are still here, they don't want it. The communist voters, those who vote for the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, they don't want it. The mainstream, if you like, Putin-supporting Russian patriots don't want it. Orthodox Christians don't want it. Russian monarchists don't want it. Russian Muslims don't want it. Russian Buddhists don't want it. Nobody here has any desire to make war on Russia. The leaders of Great Britain, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand are lying to you for their own agendas. And let us not forget that these people are Epstein Islanders. Whether they have actually been to Epstein Island or not is completely irrelevant. Epstein Islanders invaded the UK in 1066. Of course, Epstein hadn't been born. But this practice has been going on for millennia. millennia. So you are now going to be forced into a war with Russia. Now, Europe has never won a war with Russia. Every single flat-out attack for the last 1,000 years was defeated by the Russians. The only one which worked, and hence the Western elite's absolute desire for regime change here, was in 1917, when it was not a flat-out attack. In theory, countries like Britain and France were allies of the Russian Empire, but in fact they were all plotting to overthrow the Russian Empire, and this was the main reason for World War I. British, non-Jewish but Zionist Prime Minister David Lloyd George was fanatically committed to the Bolshevik takeover of Russia in 1917. All his cabinet were except Churchill, but Churchill couldn't do anything about it. Anyway, that's another story. Many people will be surprised if you're still inside the right versus left, if you think the problems in the world are about capitalism versus communism, or socialism, or fascism versus communism, or Protestants versus Catholics, or any of this stuff they invented for us to fight about. No, it's not. It's about right and wrong. And Russia is absolutely no threat to Western Europe whatsoever. Obviously, this could become what's known as a self-fulfilling prophecy if this continues. Well, you, dear Westerners, are millions and millions and millions, and your Epstein Island dictators that you've got over there now are a few thousand. Let's not forget that the world is run according to insider whistleblowers who left the system by about 8,000 to 8,500 people usually. And according to some, I will quote certainly Ronald Bernard, as he's very public on this, 90% of them are practicing Luciferians. That means Epstein Islanders. That means sacrifices of little children to Baal, to the devil. And that is what we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. So if you, the same people who are imposing on you a war with Russia and planning to bring about conscription and so on, like in the good old days of the First World War and Second World War, yeah, the same people who are doing that are the same people who are forcing on you digital ID that apparently 87% of the British public have publicly, in opinion polls, continually said they don't want. Now, 87%, that's quite a lot. If none of you accept it, they can't do anything. But of course that would mean not just shouting, I don't want it. If you're working in a bank, it means you refuse to impose on the customers coming into that bank their digital ID. You refuse to demand it. Of course, the bank might sack you, but the bank can't sack everybody or it goes out of business. And so it goes on. So I repeat once more, finishing this with the absolute sure and certain fact: the Russian people, the Russian government, the Russian military do not want war with Europe. If you force it on them, on the Russians, I mean, you're going to lose. And speaking for myself, if I was anyone this time in the Russian leadership, knowing what I now know, and often Russia has been extremely naive about the true nature of the Western European rulers for a very, very long time. This time, I would not be going back. If the Russians arrive in France this time, as they did after the Napoleonic Wars and stayed there for 3 years, this time they should make absolutely sure and certain that this is the last time. And that the entire possibility for the elites and so on to take over again and start all this again in the next century or with your grandchildren and so on and so forth, this time doesn't exist. And to do that, we need to convert to Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. Christianity means orthodoxy. The orthodoxy that existed in Europe before the Great Schism, because all of this comes from the fake Christianity, which is really and truly something else. There we are, some minstrels in the gallery. To a good moment to end my speech for today. So may your God go with you, and see you all very soon. Marcus Godwin signing off from St. Petersburg, Yusupovsky Park. Goodbye.